Just relax.
Still waiting for you to sing. Is my sweater on straight? Okay, all right. I didn't realize that first time how crooked my sweater was until I watched it online. It's like, that's what Mary kept talking about. Well, we are in the middle of a 5-part sermon series on the life and ministry of Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers. We shared already his lessons on love and blessings. And then last week we talked about the importance of the neighborhood. And now we turn to feelings. And before I begin, I want to share with you an important story from his biography about a dead fish. And you get a sense of what I was sharing with our children here today. Delivered by this Presbyterian minister-educator who was so childlike himself, his message brought poignancy far beyond the trite bromides usually served to little children. As Mr. Rogers sat next to the little pile of earth marking the grave of a dead fish, he talked shyly about a death he won't forget from his own childhood. He described his friendship with his dog Mitzi and how she got too old and died. She and I were good pals, and when she died, I cried, and my grandmother heard my cry. Rogers, who never thought of himself as a performer, gave a great performance in part because it was so genuine, but also because the pacing and the tone of the storytelling were so skillful and engaging. My dad said we'd have to bury Mitzi, and I didn't want to. I thought I'd just pretend that she was still alive. But my dad said her body was dead and we'd have to bury her. Long pause. So we did. He walked back slowly into the house on his set. Even now, I can still remember Mitzi's prickly fur and her curly tail. He brought out an old picture of Mitzi the mutt, scraggly and with floppy ears, and proudly displayed it to his viewers. And then he looked directly into the camera and sang, "Sometimes people get sad." The message of the song is that the same people who get sad also later get glad. Life goes on. Isn't this what we talk about here in the church? How often has this been a setting of a funeral service or a memorial service? They're reminding us how much we miss our loved ones, our friend, our neighbor. And by and large, the church does a really good job at this. We honor the name of the deceased. We remember that God's grace is abundant, especially in our time of grief. And we say goodbyes. We say our goodbyes, either here or out at the cemetery or both. And then we often gather for a meal where we share, we laugh, we tell stories. And then we often use this as a time to meet up with friends and family that we haven't seen for a long time. And then we get it wrong. Service is over, clean up the kitchen, and we go our separate ways. Expecting and hoping that the one who was grieving will just move on. I think we kind of lack some of the practices that some other faith traditions have. For instance, in Judaism, they have a year-long grieving process that is called Yartzeit, or just stands for year time. And this, on the date of the deceased, then and only then is the person who was grieving allowed to move on. I think it's more of an authentic way to experience loss myself. Now, Fred Rogers doesn't address these issues with adults. His focus, as we know, is with children and how they perceive loss in much the same way that we grown-ups do. But as we learn from the illustration about the dead fish and Mitzi, the dog, loss and grief and owning and understanding one's feelings, especially at a time of grief, is a vital part of being a child of God, and needs to be expressed in a really honest manner and in a place that we feel safe and secure. Now, if you're just joining us, or have not seen the documentary yet, or just now hearing about Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, you may not be aware that everything that Fred Rogers did was a ministry, was guided by the very hand of God. The Leypoldt, Pennsylvania Presbyterian Church played a vital role for the Rogers family. And Mr. Rogers always felt that his TV work was a ministry. A great story from the biography. His friend Bill Barker went to bat to make sure that Fred Rogers would be ordained. You see, back then, the Presbyterian Church would only ordain you if you were willing to take and be a pastor of a church, wear the clerical garb. But Fred Rogers was convinced that his best work could be on a TV show. And in fact, his friend Bill Barker risked his career to convince the ordination board that Mr. Rogers could do more work and better work and reach more people on TV than he could behind a pulpit. Plus, he also admits that Fred Rogers was a terrible preacher. So we learned that God's guiding hand was behind everything that Fred Rogers did. And so when it comes to understanding one's feelings and expressing them in a positive manner, Mr. Rogers backed it up by Scripture. Rhonda, would you read our passage?
The reading is from Ephesians 4:31 through 5:2. Put away from you all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander, together with all malice, and be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ has forgiven you. Therefore, the imitators of God as beloved children, and live in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God.
Now, it's no surprise that we've been spending a lot of time talking about the Apostle Paul when working with Fred Rogers. Paul wrote to a church community. Last week we talked about it as a neighborhood, and he was giving them lots of encouragement. And when you think about it, in this one respect, the Apostle Paul and Fred Rogers' ministry is the same. For they both felt the call to people who were not mature. Now, when I say the word not mature, I don't want you to think of the negative phrase immature like something you say to your spouse. Quit being so immature. That's not what I mean. Paul is using the distinction here of a mature follower and an immature believer. For example, Rhonda's now going to read a passage out of 1 Corinthians.
Okay, this is from 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 6. When I came to you, brothers and sisters, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I came to you in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. My speech and my proclamation were not with plausible words of wisdom, but with a demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might rest not on human wisdom, but on the power of God. Yet among the mature we do speak wisdom, though it is not a wisdom of this age or of the rulers of this age who are doomed to perish.
When Paul spoke to mature Christians, those followers, those who were doing and practicing ministry for a long time, he said one thing. And then those who were newly converted, those who were just listening to the practices and beliefs of Jesus for the first time, I like to call them baby Christians. Paul uses another. He uses another term so that they have something that they can graft onto and understand. Let me share with you an example from one of my seminary textbooks. The miraculous healings are part of the proclamation of God's reign, and in this context are subordinated to and aligned with the message. They signal the eschatological change and allow the dynamic presence of God's reign to be experienced in its healing, helping, and saving power. Incorporated in the process of the proleptic revelation of the kingdom, they share in particular in the struggle against wickedness and evil, which, though already overcome in principle, continue to be effective in the world. So, Val, what did that mean? There's a lot. Okay, so this was one of the hardest books that I read when I was in seminary. Basically, the author is saying to understand Jesus' miracles takes faith. Now, why did he just say that? Paul knows that mature Christians that are studying theology, that have an education behind it, can unpack that quote. But those who are just starting out, those baby Christians, you would never want to share with them that phrase. Fred Rogers is speaking to the immature, the not mature, and saying that children need to understand and own their feelings so that they can grow into well-adjusted, mature people in society. And of course, this was very Christ-centered. Let me share with you this quote from a sermon that he gave in 1972. You see, I believe that Jesus gave us an eternal truth about the universality of feelings. Jesus was truthful about his feelings. Jesus wept. He got sad. Jesus got discouraged. He got scared. And he reveled in things that pleased him. For Jesus, the greatest sin was hypocrisy. He always seemed to hold out much greater hope for a person who really knew the truth about himself or herself, even though that person was a prostitute or a crooked tax collector. Jesus had much greater hope for someone like that than for someone who always pretended to be something he wasn't. That quote really gets at the heart of being authentic. An authentic witness, an authentic follower, one who is true and honest. Not only in your faith life, but in everything that you do in life. And this includes one's feelings. The biography that I've been using and following for the sermon series was written by Maxwell King, describes this as signature Fred Rogers. He says, while speaking into the camera, Mr. Rogers said, "It helps to say that you're sad. Often it helps to cry. Let people know how you feel." This is Rogers' signature message. Feelings are all right. Whatever is mentionable is manageable, however confusing and scary life may become. Even with death and loss and pain, it's okay to feel all of it and then go on. Now, I'm not naive enough to believe that owning one's feelings is easy. It truly is a process of maturing. And with maturing, it takes time. Even Fred Rogers recognized this. He said, all our lives we rework the things from our childhood, like feeling good about ourselves, managing our angry feelings, being able to say goodbye to people we love. This is a process that takes time. Rogers once replied to a young viewer's letter with an explanation of how important it was to manage one's feelings. How important managing one's feelings can be. He wrote, "You wondered if I ever get angry. Of course I do. Everybody gets angry sometimes. But Alex, each person has his or her way of showing angry feelings. Usually, if I'm angry, I play loud and angry sounds on the piano. I think that finding ways of showing our feelings, ways that don't hurt ourselves or anybody else, is one of the most important things we can learn to do." And as a result, as an adult, Rogers reflected on the fact that music was his emotional refuge growing up. "I was always able to cry or laugh or say I was angry through the tips of my fingers on the piano. I would go to the piano even when I was 5 years old and start to play how I felt. It was very natural for me to become a composer." And dealing with anger was a topic that Fred Rogers addressed frequently. As he explained in a 1974 letter to a brother and sister in Pennsylvania, If I couldn't allow myself to feel angry, then I would never be able to let out the happy feelings when I was happy. Sometimes children think that feeling angry with another person can hurt them, but it can't. It's only the things we do when we are angry that can hurt. And Rogers often spoke in more personal and revelatory terms in speeches. For example, when he finally addressed the traumatic incident in which he was bullied and chased home from school, he shared this moment full of feeling. I resented the pain. I resented those kids for not seeing beyond my fatness or my shyness. And what's more, I didn't know that it was all right to resent it, to feel bad about it, even to feel very sad about it. I didn't know it was all right to feel any of those things because the advice I got from the grown-ups was, just let on, you don't care, and nobody will bother you. Let on, you don't care? I felt I had no friends, and I was told to let on that I don't care. Fred told this in 2 speeches where he chose to lower his guard. And he uses the story of Fat Freddy to talk about the ways in which he was shaped by the experience of suffering. He says, what I actually did was mourn. I cried to myself whenever I was alone. I cried to my fingers as I made up songs on the piano. I sought out stories of other people who were poor in spirit, and I felt for them. Last week, someone said to me that Fred Rogers would make a good Methodist. And in my understanding of Wesley, I would agree with him. John Wesley had this belief that we all have the opportunity to go on to perfection. And when he meant perfect, he's not talking about a complete sense. When he means perfect, he's talking about a mature sense. And it just means doing those things that allows one to grow. Like being honest with our feelings and realizing that the pain of the past allows us to grow to be the person that God wants us to be. For example, when Fred Rogers was in high school, he found a way to turn adversity to a focus on what he wanted to study and where he wanted his life to go in the future. This was a pivotal theme of Rogers' life. From his earliest years, he took his fears, his loneliness and isolation, and his insecurities and turned them to his advantage. Somehow, he almost always was able to take his feelings into a place of deep introspection and emerge with a fresh and often brilliant new direction. He did this as a child, as a high school student, and throughout his life as a writer, an educator, and a television producer. Now, as I said a couple of weeks ago, you're going to notice a couple of themes that kind of run throughout this sermon series. One is sharing. And the second one is actually related to the first, and it has to do with where do we go from here with these lessons? Because I've heard many of you say to me, I sure wish Mr. Rogers was alive today. Or, we so need Mr. Rogers right now, especially with our country so divided. Well, trust me, we'll be addressing these issues over the remaining weeks. But today, let's just glean some wisdom from Fred Rogers and the Apostle Paul, who both say that owning your feelings can be very powerful and leads us to be more honest and authentic and certainly more mature. The Apostle Paul understood this, and Fred Rogers undoubtedly promoted this. We're going to end our message today by sharing with you a little bit longer clip that comes from the documentary. It put Fred Rogers onto the national stage by acknowledging our feelings and that children need a positive outlook to express them. And as we watch this, I want you to notice one other thing. If we are an authentic witness, especially with our feelings, we can make a huge difference in the world. Taylor?
And then Nixon became president, and he wanted to cut the funding.
The beginnings of PBS was going to probably be dismantled by Richard Nixon, whose approach to media was to threaten stations if they didn't behave politically.
Nixon had a problem with his budget. He had to find money for the Vietnam War. It wasn't a lot of money in today's terms, but he wanted to cut the budget.
In the midst of all this, Fred Rogers gets to go before Congress, argue for $20 million of funding to sort of solidify PBS in front of John Pastore, who's the senator who had already sort of made his congressional bones by attacking television.
This is going to be a thorough hearing. This is going to be a hearing not to reach for a headline, but to reach for a result.
There have been 2 days of hearings, and he hasn't been very impressed. If you've been watching those hearings and you had to bet on whether or not PBS was going to keep going, no.
That educational television should permanently struggle for subsistence is intolerable.
All right, who's the next witness?
Senator Pastore told the group, I've heard everybody read your testimonies. I don't want anyone to read anymore. I'm tired of hearing the reading. When I heard about that, I thought, uh-oh, Fred.
All right, Rogers, you got the floor.
And I could hear in his voice the nerves.
Senator Pastore, this is a philosophical statement and would take about 10 minutes to read, so I'll not do that. One of the first things that a child learns in a healthy family is trust. And I trust what you have said that you will read this. It's very important to me. I care deeply about children. My first children...
Will it make you happy if you read it?
I'd just like to talk about it if it's all right. This is what I give. I give an expression of care every day to each child to help him realize that he is unique. I end the program by saying, you've made this day a special day by just your being you. There's no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are. And I feel that if we in public television can only make it clear that feelings are mentionable and manageable, we will have done a great service. Could I tell you the words of one of the songs which I feel is very important?
Yes.
This has to do with that good feeling of control, which I feel that children need to know is there. And it starts out, what do you do with the mad that you feel? And that first line came straight from a child. I work with children, doing puppets in very personal communication with small groups. What do you do with the mad that you feel? When you feel so mad you could bite. When the whole wide world seems oh so wrong, and nothing you do seems very right. It's great to be able to stop when you've planned a thing that's wrong and be able to do something else instead and think this song. I can stop when I want to, can stop when I wish, can stop anytime. Know that there's something deep inside that helps us become what we can.
I think it's wonderful. I think it's wonderful. Looks like you just earned the $20 million.
Now you're getting a sense of the legacy that Fred Rogers left. His basic theme was, you can be a master of the mad that you feel by expressing your special talent, whatever it may be. But you know what I think is more important? Is the power that we grown-ups have in shaping not just the young and the immature, but those sitting next to you in the pews, those sitting next to you in your workplace, those sitting next to you in the doctor's office. Probably one of the most powerful programs that occurred in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood was the day after Robert Kennedy was assassinated. Yeah. And what was most striking about that is he seems to be speaking directly to the parents about the graphic displays of violence shown in mass media. He pleads for your protection and support of your young children. There is just so much that a very young child can take without it being overwhelming. Well, we all know that Fred Rogers is not with us anymore. And the Apostle Paul is not writing any more letters. But we can still take their wisdom and learn and grow and mature. But more importantly, we can take their witness and shape these to our example. Own your feelings. Be authentic. And let us be the mature Christians that God wants us to be. Amen. Well, we're going to give the ushers a workout here since they can't come down the center aisles. But we turn it over to them as we give back to them.